this thing on? Because it's getting ready to be on.
Hello and welcome to Bell Ringer. My name is Greg. Your guests named today are Ekua Mends-Aidoo and Kendra Brim. Ekua works at Evergreen Health. Kendra works at Nardin Academy. They're both DEI consultants on the side and together host the Black Gems Dive In podcast. We talk tactics to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, and all about their podcast, why they started it, what they discuss, and where you can listen. Thanks to them for their time, and you for yours in listening. Enjoy the episode. Let's start by just telling the audience a bit about yourselves, and Ekua, we'll start with you, and then Kendra a second.
Yeah, so my name is Ekua Mends-Aidoo. I currently am the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at Evergreen Health, but I am the co-host along with Kendra for the Black Gems Dive In podcast, a podcast that we talk about everything DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and inclusive cultures. And so Kendra and I came together, was it last year? Time is flying. So we came together last year around when everything kind of shut down for the pandemic and said, you know, we got some things to talk about, and we wanted to come together to create a space, especially from our own perspectives as women of color and Black women, to talk a little bit more about what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like. I'm a native of Syracuse, New York, but I've been in Buffalo for school and never left. So I am still here.
How about you, Kendra?
So hello, everyone. I am Kendra Brim. I am the Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Opportunity at Nardin Academy. I'm excited to serve in this role because it is a newer role. And as Ekua said, I am the other co-host of Black Gems Dive In podcast. One thing that Ekua did not mention is that both her and I do have our own consulting companies as well. And the great thing about that is that we know that there is a need, especially here in Western New York. And so we're able to always bounce ideas off of each other. We collaborate often. It's never a competition type thing, which is always great because we know that we want to make Buffalo better. And so I am a native to Buffalo, New York, been here all my life. I left for school and came back, but I know that our city needs our voices. And so we did talk about this last summer about how can we get our voices out there as a collective, bring on different guests and talk about hot topics that we sit back and talk about on a regular basis. And so being able to bring that in a podcast form has been excellent so far. And we are currently on season 2, which is very exciting because never thought we would be podcasters, I guess. So it's exciting.
Yeah, I was actually, I was able to listen to a few as I was prepping for today. So I love it. So you guys talked a little bit about, you know, like the why and the timing. Tell folks kind of what they can expect, you know, when they tune in.
Yeah, so you know, we're really keeping our ears and eyes on the ground in terms of what's happening. So every episode we bring up a hot topic. We're talking about things that are happening either in our local community, regional community, or at a national level. Things like what other companies are doing, what areas you might need to be focused on, but then also practitioners in this space, what things you might need to be focused on and aware of as things are kind of changing through the landscape of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think at the basis of every conversation, we're talking about what's happening, but then we're also diving into another topic that's relatable to the space at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think also too, when we explore the ideas of DEI and what does that truly mean, many people may think it's just when we talk about DEI, we're talking about just race and ethnicity, but we talk about so much more than that. And we talk about, you know, ability, disability, and there's so much that you can talk about. And so when we come together in our different conversations, it's like, okay, there's so much happening in the world. So how can we kind of hone in and then also lean on our guests that come to our podcast as well? So we've had many guests from multiple areas across DEI, across the spectrum, not only locally, but also nationally as well, and kind of tapping into their expertise as well as their opinions about what's going on in our country, as well as in our local area.
And in your first answer, Kendra, you talked about the importance of, you know, like shining this light on these topics and using your voice to do so. You both work at, you know, at least somewhat community facing organizations. you both have your own consulting businesses, and then through this podcast, and Kendra, you were recently featured in Buffalo Business First as well. So, I guess my question is, making yourself so visible in the community. I guess, one, what opportunities have come from that, and two, why do you think that's important to do? Kind of using yourself as that channel.
Right. For me personally, I've always been involved in the community. I'm a very community-based person. And so this work with DEI is something that comes naturally, because it's something that I've been talking about and working on for years. And because of the events that we saw that happened in our country last year, now the need is even greater and our voices are even more amplified. And so those opportunities that come are obviously, speaking engagements, consulting opportunities with different companies, things like that. We're at a point now, critical point in our country, where we're moving from conversation to action. And you're starting to see that divide of what companies are kind of still staying in just that conversation and what companies are trying to move to that action. And so those opportunities that are available are for those companies that are looking for that action. I think we've moved past the community forums and the round tables and things like that. What is next? And so those opportunities that are there are able to collaborate, right? So Ekua and I collaborating with the podcast, that's one way to amplify those voices. But then also too, working with other people as well, bringing in different community stakeholders so that we can make things better. Because it's not just let me just sit back and do consulting. It's okay, well, let me bring in different stakeholders from different places within the community to make it better as a whole. We say Buffalo's one big living room and everyone knows each other, but how can we benefit off of that energy to make it more inclusive for not only people who live here, but people who are also moving to the city?
And Ekua, where can people listen to the podcast that, might be listening today?
Yeah, so we are on all networks, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, at Black Gems Dive In Podcast. And then you can find us also on social media, Instagram at Black Gems Dive In, and on Facebook at Black Gems Dive In Podcast.
Awesome. So I want to kind of zoom out macroscopically and talk about DEI as it relates to companies, a lot of the work that you guys just mentioned and, roll up your sleeves and often do. So let's start just broadly, how does representation impact, retention and talent attraction for companies? Because I think that's often maybe not the first question, but the first point that you might want to make to somebody as they're starting to go from, the community roundtable to actual action.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple reasons why representation matters. And I think first and foremost, when we have these conversations with companies, we talk about how our nation is changing. America's demographics are changing. And so in the US, by the year 2065, we'll be what you call a plurality nation, which means there won't be one single ethnic or racial majority in our country. And this is already happening in certain areas within the country. So when you think about the work that you do, because you always have to relate it back to the business that you do. So whether that be healthcare, whether that be banking, whether that be education, all these different realms and industries, the demographics are changing. And so in order to authentically connect to folks, you need to understand these different perspectives. And so we often talk about cultural humility and this understanding of having this interpersonal stance that is other oriented. We have to be oriented to other people that are not like us in order to properly and betterly serve them and advocate for them. And so I would say that representation in that facet matters, not only having it within your organization from a diversity perspective, but the inclusion component is most important because you want to make sure that you're listening and hearing the things that you need to do as an organization to create more opportunities to engage your own consumers, stakeholders, and your staff as well. And I think I always highlight that staff component because diversity is a fact, either it's there or not. Inclusion is a choice. And if you exclude folks, that diversity won't stay in your organization. And so I think from that perspective and things that are changing and shifting, it's really important to keep this top of mind so that you're not left behind.
Right. And it benefits everyone, right? We know that when you make an environment more diverse and inclusive, it benefits everyone as a whole from the bottom up. A lot of times when we go into companies and talk to many people, we start with a business case because that's the way that you kind of get in the door to say this really affects your bottom line, but it affects the company as a whole, from innovation to creativity to just flourishing as a whole. And so we know that it's definitely needed as we move forward.
Right. And you mentioned the difference between diversity and inclusion. How can an organization or, an employer look to improve diversity and avoid maybe tokenism?
And I'm glad, that you brought that distinction, because it's a lot of companies, if you're really just trying to move quickly, because a lot of organizations, thinking about what happened last year in terms of the racial unrest and the things that people were talking about, they want to do something now and they want to, put something together. And so a lot of organizations, what they do, we know what we need to hire a person of color and put them in this type of position. But the reality is oftentimes it leads to that tokenism because you haven't really tilled your own land. You haven't looked inward as an organization to see what your culture is like. Is it an inclusive environment? Is it somewhere where people can thrive? Is it somewhere where people can bring their best selves to work, and most of their best selves to work? And so those are things that I think organizations have to take a step back and look inward to get a better sense of what you're perpetuating. You think about how you onboard folks. What are you telling people? Are you talking about this inclusive culture and the way that your conduct is conducted in your own organizations? Are you telling people that these are our values that we live by, and this is what we're going to insert into our values? These are all ways that I think organizations can make sure that it's not only top of mind, but to avoid creating this sense of place where we're just hiring you because you're a person of color and you represent a specific demographic. So I think that's a really great point that you bring up. We have to make sure that we're doing the work inwardly in order to ensure that we're doing more than that.
So for those people that maybe are kind of stuck in the middle, for lack of a better term, the people that a person of color that's already working at an organization that doesn't have that support infrastructure, or, hopefully is in the process of building it. Kendra, what kind of networking opportunities outside of that company here in our community are available for those folks?
Yeah. So there's so many affinity groups that are out in our community. And we know that affinity groups are very important because they do create safe spaces for people. So there are so many organizations, from the Buffalo Urban League. We have so many young professional groups. I always tell people too, my starting point when I was getting started is Buffalo Niagara Partnership 360, because they have a young professionals guide. Right. And from there, you're able to get involved in so many different groups in wherever your interests lie, whether it is DEI, whether that is HR, whether that's arts and culture. There's something for everyone. There's also a group that was created a few years ago called the Black Professionals of Western New York. And they focus mainly on activities around the city. And so there's a lot of newcomers, a lot of transplants in that group. And that's a way that they're able to bond and find different ways to know about our city and our culture. And so there's so many groups. I always tell people to get involved because also too, like I keep saying, Buffalo is very small, but the network is also very strong. And so once you get connected with one person, you're able to get connected to 2 people, 4 people, and the list keeps growing. So there's also different opportunities that way. Go to meetings. Now it's very easy to do it virtually as well. So make sure you're tapping into that. But, once you are involved in those groups, there's so many ideas that can come from that you can also bring back to your company. We also talk about while you're at a company, you want to make sure that you're making the best of it while also cultivating your own professionalism as well. And so that's a way to definitely do it. But there's so many groups out here in the city.
And Ekua, what would your recommendations be to companies to start building that infrastructure inward? A lot of, bigger companies have like a young professionals group or something, but how do you kind of solidify that, that more long lasting feeling of inclusivity?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. A lot of organizations want to jump in this work, but like I said, you have to take that step back. And so I would recommend that organizations interested in really shaping and changing that culture do a cultural audit. So what that really is working with either a consulting company or another organization, because it's great to get the ears and eyes outside of your own scope and your own landscape to come in. Ask questions. They're going to be interviewing not only your executive leadership within the company, but also your frontline staff and what their feelings are really like, and do it in a way where you ensure that those feelings stay confidential, but you're able to kind of summarize it to some form of report that you then share back with the leadership and say, hey, these are the things that we heard, whether that be an inclusive workplace assessment as well. What's your physical environment look like? Is that inclusive? When you walk in, what pictures are hanging on the wall? Is that representative of the communities that you're interacting with? People pay attention to these things. And so I think doing a cultural audit will give you a larger sense and a better sense of what's happening with your own organization. And then from there, now we're talking about accountability, because once you're aware of all these different things that you might need to fix, or some things that might be going well and you need to maybe amplify that, you then need to make sure that someone is keeping that and holding the organization accountable for now moving and advancing that work. Because oftentimes what we see is, you'll sit there and you'll do these surveys or you'll talk to your staff to kind of get an understanding of what's happening, but there's not one person that really owns that and now is being performed and evaluated, their performance evaluated based on making sure that some of that is happening within organizations. So I would say, not only do that audit, but make sure there's some form of accountability and someone owning that within your organization to make sure that they're advancing that. And there's a couple different ways that people do that. They hire diversity folks, like Kendra and I in a space, and I shouldn't say or, because a lot of the more successful companies do that. They have someone who own it. And they also do things like diversity and inclusion leadership councils, where they'll have a cross-functional team put together that has little subcommittees that have a focus on, maybe it's your HR and your data or your compliance. Maybe it's your marketing, your PR, your outreach and communications. We also have a bucket for resource groups. So you're creating now this more inclusive space where there's these affinity groups that are coming together and bringing your staff together to ensure that they're engaged as well. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, but I would recommend starting with that inward look through a cultural audit and an assessment in that way, and then making sure that you're holding yourself accountable to following through on that.
And Kendra, on the recruiting side, recruiting for talent, are there certain methods that our companies maybe overlook or maybe are using too much that lead to a lack of diversity within their talent pipeline?
Right. So the first thing too is when a lot of companies, they want to recruit and they want to recruit for diversity. And we know that's the easy part. But one thing I would just take a step back to say is that also too, companies need to look within. A lot of times we have excellent employees who can be cultivated and mentored and be able to promote themselves throughout the company. And so a lot of times we look outward for the expertise where we need to kind of look inward, going back to what Ekua was saying. We sometimes have the expertise in-house. We know obviously it's cheaper for a company. They don't have to do as much onboarding, things like that. And so it kind of benefits the company while having someone that knows the ins and outs of, and it's tied to the mission and values of our company, right? So that's the first thing. But when we're looking for just recruiting and hiring, one thing that we talk about all the time is we put job opportunities out there and we say, man, we're not getting that diversity we're looking for, whether it is from a racial standpoint, ethnic standpoint, gender. And a lot of times we have to review those job descriptions and looking at it from, do we have a biased lens, right? Is it male oriented? Is it female oriented? Kind of looking at some of those things and really do a deep dive in evaluating the job descriptions. Sometimes people just send out a generic job description, but it really needs to make sure that we take that bias out of it. So that's the first thing. And then also to be intentional with your relationships, relationship building. We know that, you can go to Indeed.com or whatever the case may be, LinkedIn, and apply for a job, but it's really about those connections and who do you know within that job itself. And so when we're talking about networking, when we're talking about, what group should we work with in our community, that's what it's really all about, because that's how you start to build organic relationships as well. So altogether, that creates an excellent mix of hiring for your company that will represent your company to the best of its abilities. And again, it just helps everyone, like I said, from innovation to creativity, things like that. But the first step would be, before you're looking outward, to look inward and see what you have in-house first.
And I want to give you guys kind of the last word before I move into our Blizzard round. So anything else you think that maybe I haven't asked that, companies should know, a business owner or an HR manager that's listening, something we haven't touched on?
I don't know. I just keep going back to the topic that we talked about, like Ekua was talking about, is make sure that you have someone that is responsible for your DEI activities. So many companies lean on HR, right? They lean on people who are already tapped out in terms of time and resources. Make sure that you're being deliberate in building up your diversity plan moving forward. A lot of times we see also too that sometimes it falls on the only, maybe right now, Black person in your company, and that creates sometimes 3, 4, 5 extra jobs for them. So we want to make sure that we're being intentional with our diversity efforts moving forward. And that's something now that we're starting to see where companies are kind of struggling with that. So really take a look at yourselves to see where can we pull these resources from.
And I would just add, this is not easy work. I think a lot of organizations want a quick fix. We know that there were things that were happening external to us, but how do we fix this now? We just need to put some type of, whatever it is, initiative together, or we need to, do something quickly and kind of figure it out. But the reality is this work takes time. And I think when you think about the industry that you're coming from, it took time for you to build that organization or that business and get to a certain point and where you're at. This is another layer. We know that there's a lot of ROI on if you do this right. And so I would say stick in it for the long haul, and get comfortable being uncomfortable, because there's going to be a lot of times where it's not easy. It's not the easy thing to fix. We need to hire someone immediately. We just need to fill the slot. And although we want diversity, we know it's going to take so much longer to try to look for what that is in the company. But we know that longer term, it's going to pay off. And so I would say if you really focus on, streamlining your efforts and putting the infrastructure in place now, it'll be that much easier the next time that something comes along, right? And so it's not easy work, but it is definitely you'll be rewarded in doing so. And so I would say stick it out, tough it out, and just take it one day at a time.
Well, thank you both very much for your time and insights today on the podcast, and obviously all of your activity within our community beyond it. Before I let you go, we always end on a couple hard-hitting Blizzard round questions. So we'll go Kendra first, then Ekua. If you were a flavor of ice cream, what would you be?
Mint chocolate chip.
Ooh, I'm going to go with maple walnut.
How about a book or TV show that you'd recommend?
I would say This Is Us, because that's something I just watched recently and I love that show.
Show or a book? That's tough. But this is lightning, so I'm just going to, whatever comes to mind at this point. I was going to say Cast by Isabel Wilkerson is a really, really good book.
Text or phone call?
Text.
Text. I'm going to go with text too.
Bills or Sabres?
Go Bills.
Bills Mafia.
Easy choice currently. Hiking or skiing?
Hiking. We love to hike. Hiking.
Hiking, ditto.
And last question, most important, chicken wings, drumstick or flat?
Flats all the way.
I'm not picky. I'm gonna do both. I'm gonna do both.
Awesome. Thank you both very much for your time. Bell Ringer is a podcast by Invest Buffalo Niagara, the region's privately funded, nonprofit marketing and economic development organization. Please rate this podcast, follow our social media channels, and read our blog at buffaloniagara.org for the best of Buffalo Niagara. Come grow your business with us.